Now that the bye-apocalypse is behind us, it's time to focus on the 4 F's of life. Friends, family, food, and yes, football. So grab those stretchy pants, you know the ones, and get yourself an extra helping of football this weekend. We have 3 games on the docket on Thanksgiving Day that will give fantasy managers a case of the meat sweats, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. We had the Raiders and Chiefs on Black Friday. There are also 11 games on Sunday with the Bills hosting the 49ers on Sunday Night Football, and as we close out Week 13, we have the Cranberry Bowl between the Broncos and the Browns. If you have spent any time in our RotoBaller Discord channel, you are already ahead of the competition, and hopefully you managed to slide in Amir Abdullah into your fantasy lineups while sending Ramondre Stevenson and Najee Harris to your bench. You also know that running backs, they do matter once more. Las Vegas, New York, Tennessee, they all let their alpha dogs go this offseason and now have a combined 7-26 record, while Josh Jacobs, Saquon Barkley, and Derrick Henry have been among the top running backs all season long. It's time to separate those Week 13 fantasy must-starts from those Week 13 fantasy turkeys with this week's RotoBaller starts and sits at the running back position. Let's start with those Week 13 starts, those fantasy football booms, and we're starting with Kyren Williams of the Los Angeles Rams as they head to New Orleans to take on the Saints. Kyren Williams has averaged more than 4 yards per carry in 6 of the last 8 contests after failing to reach that mark from weeks 1 through 3. Williams has also reached double-digit fantasy production in all but 1 contest this season, yet many still need to determine how he stacks up against the rest of the fantasy field amongst those elite fantasy options. When you have the love of your coach, nothing else matters. In fact, Williams, he's fumbled 5 times in the last 7 contests, twice again last week, and yet he's still outtouched Blake Corum 16-1. Let's face it, this is Williams' backfield, for better or for worse. Ball security is just a couple words when it comes to job security. All kidding aside, if Williams can hold onto the ball this week, he will be in line for a highly productive afternoon. Throughout the 2024-2025 campaign, the New Orleans Saints have allowed 25.10 fantasy points per game to the running back position. The 12 rushing touchdowns, that is the 4th most, while the 1,198 rushing yards surrendered, that is the 9th most this season. The next running back we're going to start talking about here this week, how about Bucky Irving of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as they head into Carolina to take on the Panthers? Hello, Bucky! Bucky Irving, he came to play in week number 12, picking up over 150 scrimmage yards. And Irving, he's proving to be one of the better all-around backs this season and arguably the most elusive. On Sunday, Irving finished with a 59% route participation and caught all 6 of his targets for 64 yards. Irving also had 18 touches in which he forced 9 missed tackles, and it's not often that we see a running back have 7.3 yards per carry accompanied by 7.3 yards after contact per attempt. That is special, people. That is special. We don't see that every day. Irving, he is likely to see his route participation grow. On those 6 receptions, he forced 5 missed tackles and is now 5th amongst running backs this season in yards per route run. This is starting to feel like one of those "why is Uncle Larry even here" type moments, except Uncle Larry is really Rachaad White. Now heading into week 13, Irving is 4th in yards per carry, 5.4, 7th in first down per touchdown efficiency there at 25.9%, 5th in EPA per rush at 0.07, and 1st in yards after contact per attempt at 4.19. If I were the Carolina Panthers, I'd already be waving that white flag. Something tells me that league high 29.28 fantasy points allowed per game, that is going to take a substantial jump this week. And the third running back that I'm starting this week, how about James Cook of the Buffalo Bills as they take on the San Francisco 49ers? It's Thanksgiving, and we need to make sure that we have a cook in the kitchen. And this isn't the same 49ers defense that we have feared in years past. Last week, Josh Jacobs, he tore through this defense like one of my sons tearing through the mashed potatoes. Jacobs ended up with 106 rushing yards, 3 touchdowns, averaging 4.1 yards per carry in a Nick Bosa-less defensive front. Back in week number 11, Kenneth Walker III, he would finish with 13 fantasy points thanks to a touchdown. And in week 10, Rachaad White and Bucky Irving, they both posted 17 fantasy points apiece thanks to their touchdowns. You have to go all the way to week number 5 to find a running back that failed to hit pay dirt against his 49ers team. In that week 5 contest, James Conner, he came up just a little bit short. However, he still managed 100 yards from scrimmage on 21 opportunities, churning out 13 fantasy points on the day. The 23.97 fantasy points per game allowed and the 14 touchdowns the 49ers have surrendered this season, that bode well for James Cook and fantasy managers. Now let's talk about those Week 13 fantasy football busts. And we're going to bring this full circle and we're going to come back to James Conner against the Minnesota Vikings. One of the tougher fantasy matchups this season for running backs has been the Minnesota Vikings. The Vikings have allowed 16.97 fantasy points per game, the third fewest, due to allowing just 685 rushing yards and 4 rushing scores to backs through 11 contests. Last week, the Bears, they were able to attack this Vikings team, but they attacked them through the air. DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, they each caught a touchdown pass and combined for 192 receiving yards. That success, it wasn't really reciprocated in the ground game. There's DeAndre Swift finished with just 30 yards rushing on 13 attempts. That adds up to about a very putrid 2.3 yards per attempt. It's hard to bet against James Conner because he's one of those rare workhorse backs that's available out there. The concern here is it's hard to trust this Cardinals offense. I trust them about as much as I trust deviled eggs right now. I love them, but sometimes they don't necessarily love me back. And it does hurt the ones that I care about from time to time. Now, Najee Harris, the Pittsburgh Steelers, they are taking on the Cincinnati Bengals. And another one of those situations where I am fading the running back here. Looking back at the Week 12 snap shares, it is pretty difficult just to simply kind of glaze over this Steelers backfield snap share. Against the Browns, Najee Harris, he accounted for a 39% share versus a 57% snap share courtesy of Jaylen Warren. While Harris still led the duo in opportunities 18-14, Warren, he was arguably the more productive back, averaging 4.1 yards per carry compared to Harris's 2.6 yards per attempt. If we are to expect this backfield to be split moving forward, it is hard to project Harris as much more than a flex play at best, especially when facing a Bengals unit that allows 20.02 fantasy points per contest, which is the 7th fewest. Cincinnati is also allowing just 108.3 total yards per game to backs. If you split that evenly between the Steelers' backfields, you are left with about 54.2 total yards apiece. Harris, hey, he has been a solid back throughout his career. Currently, Harris is 251 rushing yards away from 1,000, which would be his 4th consecutive 1,000-yard season to start his career. And I'm starting to get kind of that Eddie George type vibe when we talk about Najee Harris, a solid back who can produce with volume. However, in George's final 5 seasons, the Titans' back never averaged more than 3.7 yards per carry, and Harris, he's currently averaging 3.9 yards per attempt in his 4th season. And finally, we talked about DeAndre Swift a little bit earlier. Guess what? He is sitting this week for me against the Detroit Lions on Thanksgiving Day. Remember when you're about 12 years old sitting at the kiddie table for Thanksgiving thinking, next year will be the year I get to go to the grown-up table? Then you turn 13 and you're still at the kiddie table? I have to imagine that is exactly how DeAndre Swift feels right about now. Last week against the Vikings, Swift was held to 2.3 yards per carry, thinking Week 13, things are going to get better. Think again! Only the Kansas City Chiefs are allowing fewer fantasy points this season to running backs than the Detroit Lions. Detroit has allowed just 7 total touchdowns to backs and has allowed an average of 92.4 scrimmage yards per game to the position, making it hard to trust Swift this week considering the matchup. That might not even be the worst part of it all. Since Thomas Brown took over play calling, we have seen more involvement from Rashawn Johnson there. Last week, Swift had a 55% snap share, but Johnson, he saw his snap share go up to 38%, which has been trajecting upward over the last couple weeks. I need touchdowns when we're talking fantasy football, and Johnson has to feel like Jalen Hurts all over again for Swift. Again, Johnson punched it in from that 1-yard line last week, marking his 8th carry inside the 5 this season, and Johnson has scored on 6 of those 8 touches. You want to score? Head over to RotoBaller.com for all the latest news and fantasy analysis, and head over to the RotoBaller Discord channel where you'll catch me there 24/7. Gobble gobble. See you next time.